Hello, my name is Dorit Geva. I am a sociologist at Central European University and also currently the Dean of Undergraduate Studies at CEU. I have contributed an article to the journal Theory, Culture and Society in a special issue on post-neoliberalism edited by Nick Gain and Will Davies. And the topic of the article is trying to make sense of the nature of the political regime currently in Hungary. I became interested in this topic because I had been and have been researching the French radical right for several years, for some 7 years by now. But at the same time, I was also living in Hungary while I was working at Central European University and observing the emergence of the Orbán regime in Hungary and its increasing consolidation of power, and noticing also that there isn't really, or there hasn't been a good conceptual set of categories to make sense of the regime that the world has been witnessing emerge in Hungary. So some call it authoritarian, some call it radical right, some say that it has elements of fascism, some call it populism. But observing it from somebody who was living in Hungary, but also in comparison to the French radical right, none of these terms seem to entirely capture what we were seeing emerging in Hungary. So the article attempts to make a systematic analysis of the totality of the regime which Viktor Orbán has established in Hungary. And so I use a Gramscian analysis to try to make sense of it and argue that these terms, these 20th century terms like fascism, authoritarianism, and populism are not sufficient for making sense of the current regime that we've seen emerge in Hungary. So I call the regime ordo-nationalist, and that's a term that I developed drawing from the concept of ordo-liberalism. So this is a political philosophy and an economic theory from the early 20th century, which argued that the role of the state is to be a strong state in order to effectively manage capitalist competition. And at the same time, I combine that, the ordo, with a portmanteau, attaching it to the concept of nationalism. And I argue in this paper that what we've seen in Hungary is the emergence of a ordo-nationalist regime, which is also hegemonic. It's a very entrenched regime at this point. And I argue that it has three essential features. The first is the reemergence of a state, which I call a kind of comeback state, which Orbán has been working on for years to centralize the power of the state, to make the state a muscular, powerful entity which very aggressively manages capitalist investment into Hungary and also the nature of capitalist investment within Hungary. So that's the first element. The second element is that the state is captured through clientelist networks that are tightly tied to the party. And so this comeback state is not the classic neoliberal state of the late 20th century, but it's a capitalist state that is also centrally held and clientelistically held by a central figure and his political power and in the person of Viktor Orbán, and that the extent of this also is felt throughout the totality of Hungarian society. And then the third element that I argue characterizes this new kind of regime is a novel regime of social reproduction, which is even, in certain senses, even more neoliberal than the classic neoliberal state of the 1980s and 1990s. It has, in some senses, even made the poor outside the people. So I call this a kind of neoliberal populism, and also very strongly promotes the reproduction and growth of the new middle class through a regime of social reproduction that really emphasizes consumption and supports middle-class consumption rather than, for example, economic redistribution. So through this analysis, I argue that we've entered into what we can call a post-neoliberal era, and that actually Viktor Orbán is really a pathbreaker in this. It contains elements of extensive marketization, which we're already familiar with through classic neoliberalism, but it is also post in the ways in which the state is now re-centralized as the central organ that manages neoliberalization. And I believe that these characteristics are characteristics which can be found also in other regimes. So I think in terms of thinking about the way in which this work, the specific analysis of Hungary can be connected to other research, I think it's reflected in developments that we see all over the world, ranging from Turkey's Erdogan, Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, even I think the transformations of the Republican Party in the United States and certain elements of Trumpism. And so I believe that the work that I do in this paper helps us make sense of contemporary developments in ways that both draw from what we have learned through late 20th century developments, but opens up a path to understanding transformations, and I think the new stage in neoliberalism that we find ourselves in. Thank you.